This incident occurred a couple of weeks into the summer. I had just completed high school, and it was my inaugural and likely final summer devoid of significant professional or academic commitments. Everyone acknowledges that the onset of summer marks the most delightful period of the year. So it's fair to say I was thoroughly enjoying life at that moment. In Wyoming, a widely popular custom among recent graduates involves venturing deep into the plateaus for rock climbing. Honestly, I'm not entirely certain if this tradition extends beyond my high school, but I like to believe it does. It functions as a sort of rite of passage, a celebration of newfound freedom accomplished through an activity demanding some skill and considerable courage. My friends and I had been discussing it for weeks, and we finally resolved to make it a reality. It felt like the ideal way to inaugurate what I hoped would be an unforgettable summer vacation. Our group consisted of myself, Alexandra, Nick, and Jack. We had been friends since middle school, and Alex was the only one with a car reliable enough for the journey, a Jeep she adored, and seized any opportunity to take off-road. She also served as the designated driver since she doesn't drink, which suited the rest of us perfectly, as we planned to bring a few beers to celebrate once we reached the summit of whatever plateau we chose to ascend. Our intention was to first visit the Flaming Gorge Lookout, then drive through the plateau region to find a suitable climbing spot. The lookout was breathtaking, offering one of those vistas that reminds you why you appreciate living in Wyoming. After spending about an hour capturing photographs and simply absorbing the scenery, we began our return towards Route 80, taking our time and scouting for potential climbing locations. We were proceeding along Highway 141 when we noticed a particularly striking area off to the side of the road. There were immense rock formations that appeared ideal for climbing, not overly technical, yet sufficiently challenging to warrant the effort. Alex pulled into a small gravel lot, and we retrieved our gear, filling our backpacks with beverages. The plateau we selected was perhaps a 15-minute ascent to the top. Nothing overly strenuous, just a steady scramble up the rock face with ample handholds and footholds to make it manageable. I possess numerous photographs from that day, primarily because Alex insisted on countless pictures of herself, so I will include some of them. Alex led the climb, being the most experienced among us, followed by me, then Nick, with Jack bringing up the rear. The view from the summit was absolutely worth the effort. We could see for miles in every direction, just endless expanses of Wyoming wilderness. We opened our beers and simply savored the moment, discussing some of our other school friends. I was somewhat lost in thought, admiring the landscape, when I observed a car speeding down the highway. It was a red pickup truck. To my surprise, after passing Alex's car, it screeched to a halt in the middle of the highway. I continued watching, and it actually began reversing right there on the highway. I pointed it out to my friends, and the four of us grew a little quieter, all wondering about the truck's intentions. It reversed until it could turn into the lot where we had parked, which it did. We all observed as someone exited the truck. From our distance, we could deduce it was a man based on his height and build, but we couldn't discern much detail. Initially, we thought perhaps he was another individual seeking a place to climb, hike, or simply rest. But then he started circling Alex's Jeep in a manner that immediately felt wrong. He was peering into the windows, attempting the door handles, and generally scrutinizing the car as if planning a break-in. That's when Nick shouted, "Hey!" from the plateau's summit to signal our presence and let the man know the car was not unattended. We saw the man flinch slightly and begin looking around, clearly uncertain of the voice's origin. Finally, he spotted us atop the plateau and actually waved. This led us to believe the incident was over, that he would probably return to his truck, understanding he couldn't get away with anything. To our surprise, however, he continued to tamper with Alex's car. In response, Jack yelled that we were armed, which I still believe was a poor decision. We obviously had no weapons, but I assumed Jack thought the bluff might deter the man. Instead, the man looked up at us and shouted something back that caused me to freeze. He said, "Me too, kiddo." Then he held something up in the air and waved it around, presumably a gun, but I couldn't distinguish it from such a distance. What transpired next was like something out of a nightmare. The man began ramming his shoulder and elbow into the Jeep's windows, clearly attempting to force entry. We could hear the impact even from our vantage point. Alex was enraged and started screaming at him to get away from the car. The rest of us joined in, shouting and making as much noise as possible, while we began scrambling down the plateau as quickly as we could safely manage. I have never descended anything so rapidly in my life. By the time we heard the sound of glass shattering, we had reached the ground and were sprinting across the lot towards the Jeep. The man saw us approaching and yelled for us to stop, pointing what I can now confirm was definitely a gun directly at us. We had no alternative but to halt and raise our hands. The man instructed us to throw our phones and wallets on the ground, which we did without hesitation. Then he commanded us to walk backward while he collected our belongings, keeping the gun aimed at us the entire time. I was close enough now to get a clear view of his face. He was an older white man, perhaps in his 50s, with a scraggly beard and somewhat weathered features. Nothing particularly distinctive, which was frustrating because I knew it would be impossible to identify him among a group of generic-looking white men. After gathering all our possessions, he produced a knife and punctured one of Alex's tires. Then he returned to his pickup truck, which I noticed lacked license plates, and drove off without another word. Alex was furious, and I don't blame her. I was mostly terrified from being held at gunpoint, but had I been in her situation, I would have been equally enraged. Not only had this man robbed us and damaged her car, but we couldn't even contact the police or pursue him, since he had taken our phones and disabled the Jeep. Jack and I changed the tire as quickly as possible, but I'm quite certain all of us knew there was no way we would do it fast enough. Once we were back on the road, Alex drove as fast as she could in the direction the pickup had gone, but he was long gone. We gave up soon after. Nick knew the way back to town by heart, so we decided to just head home and figure out what to do from there. As soon as we arrived at Alex's house, we used her mom's phone to call the police. We provided them with a description of the man and his truck, but without license plates or any other identifying information, there wasn't much they could do except keep an eye out for someone matching the description. We never heard anything back from the police, obviously, and as far as I know, the man was never apprehended. It completely ruined what should have been one of the best days of our summer, and I don't think any of us felt safe venturing into remote areas like that for at least a few months. I certainly didn't. My name is Sophia. This occurred 3 years ago when I was 19. My older brother Luke had just graduated from college in California, and the two of us were driving cross-country back home to New Jersey. Since he had resided there for 4 years, he had accumulated an entire apartment's worth of belongings: furniture, electronics, books, everything, and there was no way he could fly back with all of it. However, that wasn't the primary reason for our journey. I mean, a cross-country road trip? Sign me up for that any day of the week. I considered it a summer vacation. Even better. We could have taken the direct route through Nevada and Colorado, but Luke desired to see more of the country he had been studying, and I had never visited places like Zion or the Grand Canyon either, so we opted for the scenic route along the southern edge. Luke insisted on renting a U-Haul instead of simply shipping everything or selling it and starting afresh back home. Honestly, I believe he was also attempting to save money wherever possible, typical of a recent college graduate. The U-Haul wasn't enormous, but it was sufficiently large that I felt like we were traversing the country in a small, moving truck. Before we departed, both our parents and virtually every travel forum we consulted issued the same warning. Be cautious in New Mexico. It wasn't that the entire state was perilous, but there were accounts of scams targeting travelers, along with crime in some of the smaller towns, and generally dubious situations in the more remote desert areas. Our dad specifically instructed us not to stop there unless absolutely necessary, and if we did, to stick to major gas stations and return to the highway as quickly as possible. Luke and I agreed we would drive straight through New Mexico without stopping. We would fill up in Arizona, drive through as swiftly as possible, and stop again once we reached Texas. It seemed like a sensible plan. The initial segment of the trip was magnificent. Zion was incredible, and the Grand Canyon was everything I had envisioned. Driving through Arizona was actually remarkably beautiful, in a way I hadn't anticipated. But somewhere in the remote expanse of New Mexico, our plan unraveled. The U-Haul was getting worse gas mileage than Luke had expected, and the gauge was dropping faster than we had calculated. In retrospect, it was probably a bit naive to assume we would be able to traverse the entire state without stopping. We began searching for the next gas station along the highway, but according to our GPS, it was still approximately 40 miles away. The fuel gauge was already dipping below a quarter tank, making Luke increasingly anxious about whether we would reach our destination. He pulled over to consult the map, and at that moment, we realized we truly had no other option. A small town, about 10 miles ahead, appeared on the GPS with a gas station marked. It wasn't ideal, but it was certainly preferable to risking running out of gas in the middle of the desert. The town was minuscule, likely home to no more than a few hundred residents, if that. It possessed that peculiar quietude characteristic of some small desert towns, as if everyone was indoors, escaping the heat, even though the day wasn't particularly hot. There were a few dilapidated buildings, a modest main street, and little else. We observed no other travelers or vehicles passing through, which felt odd given our relatively close proximity to a major highway. The gas station was one of those ubiquitous establishments with a couple of pumps and an attached convenience store. As Luke was filling the tank, I noticed we were drawing some peculiar stares from the few locals present. Nothing overtly aggressive, just prolonged gazes that made me uneasy. A man leaning against the convenience store, smoking a cigarette, repeatedly met my eyes, and I had to consciously prevent myself from looking back at him. I rationalized that it was probably due to our obvious status as outsiders, driving a U-Haul with California plates, but nothing further transpired. After Luke finished refueling, I attempted to navigate us back to the highway. This should have been the straightforward part. We could literally see the highway from certain intersections within the town, yet every road we took seemed to lead us further away. It was the most perplexing experience. We would drive towards where we knew the highway was, only for the road to curve, dead end, or simply steer us in the completely wrong direction. It was as if the entire town was literally designed to inconvenience us, as ludicrous as that sounds. And before you inquire about our GPS usage, yes, we were using it, or at least attempting to, but it was proving unhelpful. It was evident that Google hadn't updated that location in ages, as the map consistently routed us to roads that no longer existed or were entirely inaccessible. Furthermore, the signal out there was practically non-existent, cycling between brief moments of connection and prolonged periods of nothingness. We ended up circling the same few blocks multiple times, and my anxieties started to mount. Luke was trying to maintain composure, but I could tell he was equally frustrated. It began to feel increasingly unnatural, as though there was something unwelcoming about that place that we should have avoided. I cannot articulate it, but the sensation of literally seeing the highway, yet being unable to reach it, was so bizarre and profoundly unsettling. After another 20 minutes of driving in circles, Luke decided to return to the gas station and simply ask for directions the old-fashioned way. I pleaded with him not to, but he practically shouted at me, asserting that we were literally trapped in the very place we had been warned to steer clear of. I could discern his heightened distress at that point, so I remained silent. Upon returning to the gas station, he went inside, while I waited in the van. When he re-emerged, a worried expression was etched on his face. He got in and explained that the attendant had given him directions, but they seemed unnecessarily intricate. According to the clerk, we needed to drive 17 miles in the opposite direction from the highway, through some desert backroads, to eventually loop back to an on-ramp. I stared at him as if he had lost his mind. In what conceivable reality would we need to drive 17 miles in the wrong direction when we could practically see the highway from our current location? I asked Luke what the man was like, and he said he seemed friendly enough, but there was something peculiar about the unwavering confidence with which he delivered the directions, as if he was trying particularly hard to convince Luke that this circuitous route was the only option. Luke also mentioned that the clerk had been asking numerous questions about our destination and the duration of our journey. Before I could even voice my concerns, Luke interjected, "I don't trust it whatsoever. We need to get the hell out of here." He simply started driving, and I offered no objection. He eventually pulled over on a quiet side street to strategize our next move. The GPS was still malfunctioning, and I felt myself beginning to hyperventilate. A small part of me couldn't help but feel that something truly terrible was about to transpire. And then, as if on cue, a dusty pickup truck pulled up alongside us. My heart began to pound, and I glanced at Luke, who, as far as I could tell, was already poised to speed away if necessary. The truck's window rolled down, and the driver asked Luke if we had broken down or were lost. Luke stared at the man for a good few seconds before responding, clearly attempting to ascertain whether we were in danger. I sat in the passenger seat, trying to regulate my breathing. That's how terrified I was. Had I been alone, I don't know what I would have done. After a tense few moments, Luke simply stated that we were heading for the highway. He also described the route we were planning to take to get there, which I recognized as the directions the gas station clerk had provided. I didn't have the best view of the man from my vantage point, but based on the tone of his voice, it sounded as though he became very serious after hearing my brother speak. He asked us if we were fucking crazy and unequivocally stated that we should absolutely not follow those directions. He went on to explain that the route my brother had described would lead us towards a truly desolate area, suspected of being a drug-running hotspot. Instead, he gave us alternate directions, then remarked that it was a miracle we hadn't been robbed already, given our cluelessness and how conspicuously we stood out, driving a U-Haul and all. Then, before we could even express our gratitude, he drove off. Neither Luke nor I spoke a word after that. Luke simply started driving, following the man's directions. True enough, about a mile outside of town, there was a gravel road, easy to miss if you weren't actively looking for it. It was the least intuitive, most convoluted highway entrance I had ever encountered. But after following the road for a considerable distance, it did indeed lead us back onto the highway, and that was that. Luke and I briefly discussed the entire ordeal, but I don't think either of us wanted to dwell on it too much. We obviously find humor in it now, and our entire family knows the story and asks us to recount it periodically. But at the time, it was the most unsettling experience we had ever had. I will never forget that indescribable feeling of being there. It was like a mixture of dread, anticipation, and anxiety, all blended into one. My brother described it as a kind of breathless limbo, where you're not quite suffocating, but you can feel it approaching. I never want to experience that again. This occurred 5 years ago. 5 summers ago, to be precise. My girlfriend at the time, whom I'll refer to as PS, had just graduated from college, with me having completed my studies a year earlier. We are no longer together, But there is no animosity between us, and I have no regrets about any aspect of our relationship, even though it eventually dissolved. She was mixed, half Croatian and half Brazilian. The two of us had always talked about embarking on a European trip together after finishing college. And if there's one thing you should know about PS, it's that if she sets her mind to something, she will stop at nothing to see it through. Call it the Latin blood. That's always the joke I made. That was simply her nature. So, as soon as she graduated, we both began planning the summer vacation we had always fantasized about. There was one glaring issue, however. We were both painfully broke, so we would have to do it on the cheap. The itinerary we ultimately settled on was quite ambitious for two people on a shoestring budget. We would spend a week in Croatia, concluding with 2 nights in Rijeka, which was PS's grandparents' hometown. She had never been there before, but she had grown up hearing stories about it from her grandmother, and I could tell she was excited to see where her family originated. Because we were trying to save every possible cent, we couldn't afford any of the nice hotels or even decent hostels. Instead, we ended up booking the cheapest Airbnbs and travel lodges we could find on short notice. I'm talking about places with 1-star reviews and photos that looked like they were taken with a flip phone. But we didn't care. We were simply thrilled to be going. Zagreb and Dubrovnik were incredible, even with our tight budget. The cities were teeming with tourists, which made it easy to blend in and find inexpensive food and free activities. But Rijeka was different. It's a port city on the northern coast, and while it's technically on the water, it's not exactly what you call a beach destination. More importantly, it definitely wasn't a popular tourist spot. Walking around, PS and I were clearly some of the only foreigners in the entire town. That should have been our first red flag. But honestly, we kind of loved it. PS speaks decent Croatian, not fluent, but enough to get by, and I was picking up bits and pieces as we progressed. We spent our first day just wandering around, conversing with locals, soaking up the authentic Croatian experience we couldn't get in the more touristy cities. PS is one of those people who can strike up a conversation with anyone, and I'm quite talkative myself, so we were having a blast just chatting with shopkeepers and random people on the street. Everyone seemed friendly enough, though I did notice we were drawing some prolonged stares. The glances we received weren't the usual curious stares tourists attract. These felt distinct, more intense, but PS appeared unconcerned, so I dismissed my own apprehension as paranoia. On our second day, we decided to venture beyond the city center in search of an authentic lunch spot. PS had heard about a cluster of small restaurants from someone at our Airbnb. It wasn't a fancy area, just a local hub, supposedly known for fantastic seafood. It was perhaps a 15-minute walk from downtown, through residential streets that grew progressively quieter as we moved away from the main thoroughfare. The restaurant itself was rather unremarkable, a small building with a few tables inside and a simple handwritten menu taped to the window. Yet the moment we stepped in, I knew PS's recommendation about the food was spot on. The aroma was incredible, clearly indicating freshness and homemade quality. We settled at a window table and ordered an excessive amount of food: grilled fish, some kind of seafood pasta, bread, and a bottle of local wine that cost around €3. I remember thinking we had truly discovered a gem. The food was absolutely superb, far surpassing anything we'd eaten in the tourist areas, and it was incredibly inexpensive. At one point, I noticed that during our meal, a group of 5 men had entered and sat just 2 tables away. They looked rough, the type one would instinctively avoid in any country. However, they were simply eating, seemingly oblivious to our presence, as far as I could tell. I was actually rather surprised I hadn't noticed them earlier. I assumed I had been too engrossed in the delicious food or wrapped up in my conversation with my girlfriend. I gave it little thought, and resumed eating, though I recall finding their loud conversation somewhat irritating. We were roughly halfway through our meal, chatting and enjoying ourselves, when PS suddenly fell silent. Her gaze was fixed past me, towards the back of the restaurant where the men were, and I could sense a change in her demeanor. Before I could inquire what was amiss, she leaned across the table and very quietly stated that we needed to leave immediately. I whispered back, asking what she meant, but she was already reaching for her purse. She insisted she was serious, and there was something in her tone that compelled me to listen. I still didn't grasp the situation, but she isn't one to panic without cause. She spoke the local language and understood the culture better than I did. If she said we needed to depart, there was likely a very good reason. I pulled out a handful of kuna bills, far more than our meal cost, and tossed them on the table, then followed her towards the door. All the while, I expected her to explain, but she just quickened her pace, practically tugging me along by the arm. It wasn't until we were outside that I finally demanded to know what was happening. She glanced back at the restaurant and said she had overheard the men talking. They were discussing what they intended to do to us, specifically to her. Her voice was slightly shaky, which alarmed me more than anything else. She said she heard them mention separating us first, and that a man named Luca would know what to do, whoever he was. She relayed other details I prefer not to repeat, but the message was unequivocally clear. We needed to get back to the main part of town as soon as possible. I suggested they might have been joking, but she shook her head, explaining that they weren't discussing desires, but concrete intentions. She felt they were talking about something routine, not a fantasy. I believed her. That's when I made the mistake of looking back at the restaurant. All 5 men were now standing outside, and they were unequivocally watching us, not even attempting to be discreet. The moment they saw me look, they began walking in our direction. I grabbed her hand and told her they were following us. Without another word, we both started running. Not jogging, not walking quickly, but full-on sprinting back towards the city center. The problem was, we were much further from downtown than I had realized, and the streets between us and safety were primarily deserted residential blocks. I could hear footsteps behind us, and when I glanced back, all 5 men were now chasing us. They had abandoned all pretense. They were openly pursuing us through the streets. It was truly terrifying. PS was in better physical condition than I, but I somehow managed to keep pace, likely fueled by adrenaline. We ran for what felt like an eternity, darting down random streets, hoping we were heading in the right direction. Finally, after perhaps 10 minutes of the most intense running of my life, we started seeing other people on the sidewalks and hearing traffic. The men ceased their pursuit as soon as we reached the busy area. I looked back one last time and saw them just standing there, about 2 blocks behind us, watching us, but not approaching further. It was as if they understood they couldn't execute whatever plans they had once there were witnesses. Both of us were completely out of breath and trembling from adrenaline. She was quietly crying, though she tried to conceal it. I had never seen her so frightened, which intensified the reality of the situation. We found a cafe in the main square and sat down, attempting to process what had just happened. That's when an older Croatian man at the adjacent table, who must have overheard us speaking English, leaned over and asked if we were all right. When we explained the incident, he simply shook his head and called us idiots. It wasn't said unkindly, but rather with an air of disbelief at our naivete. He stated that tourists should not wander alone in that part of the city, especially conspicuous foreigners like us. Then, PS described the restaurant we had visited, and the man's expression grew even more serious. What he told us literally made me feel dizzy. He explained that we had essentially stumbled into a known haunt for local criminals, a place linked to an organized crime group operating in the area. He seemed genuinely concerned for us, as though we had narrowly escaped a very grave situation. I mentioned something about contacting local authorities, and he merely laughed, but offered no further explanation. Then he paid for his coffee and promptly left the cafe. P.S. and I didn't linger much longer. We got up after catching our breath and headed directly back to our Airbnb. The remainder of our trip was effectively ruined. We were too shaken to leave our room, except to grab food from places right in the city center. We spent our last day simply sitting inside, watching TV on my laptop, and counting down the hours until our flight. Looking back, I am incredibly thankful that PS had the presence of mind to get us out of there when she did. If she hadn't understood what those men were saying, or if she had paused even slightly, I don't know what fate would have befallen us. It's one of those experiences that makes you realize how swiftly a mundane day can escalate into genuine danger, particularly when you are in an unfamiliar place where you don't fully comprehend the local dynamics. Honestly, I still feel quite foolish for being so casual in a foreign country. I know that's one of the most perilous things you can do, especially if you bear no resemblance to the locals. We didn't discuss the incident much after returning home, but I know it affected both of us deeply. PS had always been fearless when it came to travel and exploring new places, but I believe that day in Rio changed something for her, as it certainly did for me. The city of Pompeii, a bustling Roman hub, tragically met its end on August 24th, 79 AD, when it was obliterated by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. For over 1,500 years, the city lay buried under layers of ash and pumice, silently preserving its daily life. It was only in the 16th century that its hidden remnants began to surface, though dedicated archaeological efforts didn't truly commence until the 18th century. Today, Pompeii stands as a fascinating, if somber, testament to ancient Roman civilization, offering an unparalleled glimpse into its culture, architecture, and the routines of its inhabitants. Excavations have unearthed a wealth of treasures, from meticulously designed homes and public edifices to vivid frescoes and intricate mosaics. These discoveries paint a comprehensive picture of the city's sophisticated infrastructure, its well-developed legal framework, and the diverse occupations of its populace. Beyond its physical structures, Pompeii has provided invaluable insights into the social fabric of Roman life. Researchers have meticulously analyzed the artifacts and unearthed records, revealing details about the intricate social hierarchies, the varied religious practices, and the economic engines that drove the city. The perfectly preserved remains of the victims, encased in volcanic ash, offer a poignant and tangible link to the past, allowing us to connect with the individual human stories of those who lived and died there. In essence, Pompeii is more than just an archaeological site. It's a window into an entire civilization. It showcases the architectural brilliance,